My son and his wife trapped me in their home and tricked me into signing away my entire life savings, all because they thought I was just a confused, helpless old woman. I had to endure their fake smiles and condescending whispers day after day, knowing they were just waiting to cash me out to cover up their own failures. But they made one critical mistake. They underestimated me. And they had no idea that my revenge would be served in the one place they felt safest, ensuring their downfall was not only complete, but deliciously public. You know, Sundays at my son's house in Scarsdale always felt like a performance. I was the visiting dignitary, a relic to be dusted off and displayed for a few hours before being put back on the shelf. The brunch was always impeccable, of course. The silverware gleamed so brightly it hurt my eyes, and the food was arranged with the kind of precision I used to use for surgical instruments. My daughter-in-law, Catherine, would flutter around me, her concern as thin as the ridiculously expensive porcelain plates. She'd straighten my collar, plump the cushion behind my back, all with a brittle smile that never quite reached her eyes. James, my son, would spend most of the time pacing the length of their cavernous living room, his phone pressed to his ear, projecting success for an audience of one himself. He'd talk loudly about market trends and leveraged buyouts, using a language designed to impress and exclude. I'd just sit there, a silent observer in their museum of a home, surrounded by expensive modern art that looked like a factory accident. That day, though, something was off. The performance was fraying at the edges. James's polished veneer had cracks in it. He couldn't leave his phone alone, his thumb swiping and tapping incessantly. His jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscle jumping under his skin. When Catherine placed a bowl of fruit just a little too close to his elbow, he snapped at her, his voice a low hiss that cut through the pleasantries like a shard of glass. It was a tiny thing, over in a second, but it left a silence that was heavier than any words. Later, I tried to engage him. I mentioned a pharmaceutical stock I'd followed for years, something solid and dependable. He just waved a dismissive hand and launched into a dizzying monologue about derivatives and short positions and algorithmic trading. It wasn't an answer, it was a wall of noise, and I knew he was hiding behind it. The main event came after the meal, as it so often did. Catherine approached me with a handsome leather-bound folder and a pen that probably cost more than my first car. She sat beside me, her voice dripping with condescending sweetness, telling me it was just a few routine papers from James's firm. Just an update to my portfolio, she said, for tax purposes. Something to streamline things and make it all easier for me. Her hand rested on my arm as she pointed to the signature lines. "It's for your own protection," she cooed, a phrase that always means the exact opposite. I felt a familiar wave of exhaustion. It was easier to just sign than to argue to be the difficult old woman. So I did. I signed where she pointed my signature, once so firm and clear on hospital charts, now a bit shaky. I didn't see the document buried in the middle, the one that gave him durable power of attorney. I just saw my son's wife smiling, her relief palpable, as she clicked the expensive pen shut and took the folder away. Later that evening, they insisted I lie down for a rest in the guest room before the drive home. I was tired, but not sleepy. An uneasy feeling had settled in my stomach, cold and heavy. So I lay on the perfectly made bed, breathing slowly, and listened. The house was quiet for a long time. Then I heard the soft tread of James's shoes pacing back and forth in the upstairs hallway. He must have thought I was asleep. His voice was a panicked whisper, tight with a terror I had never heard in him before, not even when he broke his arm as a child. He was on the phone, the words slicing through the silence and straight into my heart. "No, you don't understand. The SEC is sniffing around. If I can't liquidate my mother's assets by the end of the quarter, it's all over. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, Please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now let's get back to it. I didn't sleep that night. I lay there in the dark, my son's terrified words echoing in the silence, and the weariness I'd felt for years burned away, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. For the first time in a long time, I felt like a head nurse again. I was assessing a critical situation, identifying the disease, and planning a course of treatment. My family was the disease. The treatment would be surgical. I rose the next morning and dressed myself in a way I hadn't in years, not as a frail old woman, but as the woman who had run a chaotic emergency room for 3 decades. Breakfast was a quiet, tense affair. James and Catherine moved around the kitchen with a forced calmness that was louder than any shouting. They thought they had a sleeping lamb in their guest room. They had no idea a lioness had woken up. I waited, stirring my tea, watching them. I waited for the moment they were both seated, trapped at the table, with their toast and lies. Then I put on my most pleasant, slightly dotty smile. I looked directly at Catherine, her face a mask of polite concern. I told her, my voice light and conversational, that I'd been thinking about that lovely charity she supported, the one for financial literacy for women. I found it so inspiring. I said that I was thinking of making a rather substantial donation myself. I just needed the director's contact information if she wouldn't mind. The effect was instantaneous and glorious. It was like I'd tossed a grenade onto the table. James, who was mid-sip of his coffee, choked a strangled sputtering sound. Catherine's hand flew to her mouth, and she dropped her fork, which clattered against the marble floor with a deafening noise. For a split second, they just stared at each other, and in that look, I saw everything, raw, naked terror. James recovered first, his face flushing a deep, angry red. He slammed his mug down and told me that was a ridiculous idea, that I couldn't just throw money away. He insisted they were managing my portfolio for maximum growth, not for charity. Catherine, scrambling, began babbling about how the charity was actually undergoing a surprise audit and couldn't possibly accept donations right now. Their stories clashed, a chaotic mess of panicked excuses that confirmed everything. They were so consumed by their own panic that they retreated to the living room, their voices hushed and frantic as they argued. It was the opening I needed. I didn't move from my chair. My hands, however, were busy. From a small hidden pocket in the lining of my handbag, I retrieved the one thing they'd never thought to look for, an ancient, non-smart flip phone I kept for emergencies. It was a relic, untraceable and simple. With shaking but steady fingers, I speed-dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang twice before a familiar, gruff voice answered. It was Arthur, my late husband's estate lawyer, a man as solid and dependable as granite. I didn't waste time. I just said his name, my name, and told him I needed him to review the blue file, and that it was urgent. The blue file was our code, something my husband and I had set up years ago. It meant the original unamended trust documents, the ones I kept in a safe deposit box, Arthur had access to. He didn't ask questions. He just said he was on it and hung up. When James and Catherine returned, the pretense was gone. The masks had been dropped. Their faces were cold, their movements clipped and hostile. They'd realized somehow that they had lost control, even if they didn't know how. James announced that for my health, they were going to help me reduce my screen time. He took my iPad from the bedside table. Catherine added that my wonderful caregiver, Maria, would be handling all my calls from now on, just to ensure I got proper rest. They weren't asking, they were informing me. The door to the guest room closed with a soft final click. I was no longer a guest in their home. I was a prisoner. And I understood then that my little probe had done more than just confirm their guilt. It had cornered a very dangerous, very desperate animal. The best strategy when you're being monitored is to give the observers exactly what they expect to see. They saw me as a frail, confused old woman, so that's who I became. I shrank. I made myself smaller in the big, empty guest room. I stopped making eye contact and started speaking in a softer, more hesitant voice. When Catherine brought my meals on a tray, I'd offer a meek apology for all the fuss I'd caused over that silly charity idea. The relief on her and James's faces was immense. You could see the tension leaving their shoulders. They'd glance at each other with triumphant, patronizing smiles. In their minds, the problem was solved. The brief flicker of defiance had been extinguished, and they had absolute control. Their arrogance was my shield, and I hid behind it, gathering my strength. Of course, I couldn't see what was happening in the dark corners of that house, but I could feel it. The truth of my son's desperation was a sickness that permeated the walls. If you could have seen him in his home office at 3 in the morning, you would have understood. You'd see a man drowning frantically, moving money from one client's account to another in a desperate digital shell game, trying to plug a hole in a dam that was about to burst. The screen of his laptop would be lit up with threatening emails from the first investors he'd duped in his Ponzi scheme, their polite inquiries having turned to barely veiled threats. An official-looking notification from the SEC would sit unopened, a digital time bomb he was too terrified to click. The sweat on his brow, the frantic, panicked clicking of the mouse, it was the portrait of a man in absolute ruin. And on the corner of his desk, a photo of his smiling family, the very people his lies were meant to protect, now the monument to his spectacular failure. That's the kind of pressure that makes a person do unforgivable things. While my son was wrestling with his demons, I was busy with my own plans. They thought I was napping for hours on end, the perfect picture of elderly decline. But I wasn't idle. My caregiver Maria, a kind and quiet woman, they saw as little more than furniture, became my lifeline. I had seen the pity in her eyes, the way she looked at James and Catherine when they weren't paying attention. I knew she was trustworthy. She became my covert operative, my link to the outside world. During her shifts, while she was supposedly helping me with my exercises, I would whisper my instructions. She smuggled small, folded notes from me to Arthur and brought his replies back to me, hidden in the folds of my clean laundry. My most important instruction was for her to go to my old apartment, the one I kept in the city. I told her to look in the back of the closet, inside a garment bag containing my old head nurse's uniform. There, sewn into a hidden compartment in the lining, was a specific set of keys and a small envelope of documents. Maria, bless her heart, didn't even hesitate. The arrogance of my captors was their greatest weakness. They believed so thoroughly in their own superiority and my senility that they became careless. One afternoon, while Maria was quietly dusting the hallway console table, she overheard a heated argument from the master bedroom. Catherine was worried, her voice sharp with fear, asking James about their mounting legal fees. And my son, bloated with a week of uncontested power, made his critical mistake. He boasted, his voice loud and clear enough for Maria to hear every single word. He told his wife not to worry. The power of attorney I signed was ironclad. By the time I figured anything out, my entire estate would be securing their new credit lines, and then the words that sealed his fate. He called me a confused old woman who had no idea what she'd done. Maria reported every syllable back to me. He had no idea he wasn't just speaking to his wife. He was giving his judgment directly to the jury. A week passed in that silent, gilded prison. A week of me playing the part of a docile, fading woman, and of them playing the part of caring, concerned jailers. The tension in the house was so thick you could taste it. Every meal was an exercise in silent warfare, the clinking of forks on plates, the only sound. They thought they were winning. They thought their condescending smiles and hollow reassurances were working. They had no idea they were living on borrowed time, that a storm was gathering just beyond their perfectly manicured lawn. The storm broke on a Thursday evening, right in the middle of a dinner of dry chicken and overcooked asparagus. The doorbell chimed a sharp, intrusive sound that made both James and Catherine jump. They exchanged a nervous look. They weren't expecting anyone. James, annoyed, threw his napkin down and went to the door, ready to dismiss whoever was interrupting their perfect, controlled evening. But he didn't come back. I heard a low murmur of voices, one of them firm and unyielding. A moment later, James walked back into the dining room, his face pale as a sheet. Behind him stood Arthur, my late husband's lawyer, looking as stern and immovable as a mountain. He was holding a thick leather briefcase, and his eyes, when they met mine, held a look of grim determination. Catherine started to flutter, asking what this was about, telling Arthur it was a bad time. He paid her no mind. He just looked at my son and stated, his voice filling the room, that he was there on urgent client business. His presence alone shattered their illusion of control. The game was over. Arthur didn't wait for an invitation. He placed his briefcase on the dining table with a heavy final thud. He was calm, methodical, his every movement radiating a power that made James shrink in his chair. He started by presenting my son with an official-looking document. He explained in clear and simple terms that it was an injunction, effective immediately freezing all of my assets due to suspicious activity and the potential for elder fraud. The word fraud hung in the air like poison. Then Arthur opened his briefcase. He slid a second document across the table. It was a sworn affidavit, he explained, from another one of James's clients, a man Arthur had found through his own network, detailing how he, too, had been a victim of my son's financial schemes. The final piece of evidence was a copy of my original unamended trust, the blue file. A document that proved the power of attorney he'd tricked me into signing was a complete violation of my long-established wishes. It was irrefutable. It was the end of the line, and James, he just broke. It wasn't a quiet crack. It was a complete, shattering collapse. A raw, guttural sob tore from his throat, and he buried his face in his hands. The confession came pouring out of him in a torrent of tears and frantic, pathetic justifications. He told us everything. The Ponzi scheme, the lies, the stolen money, the SEC investigation breathing down his neck. He never wanted this, he cried. He was just trying to save them, to save the family from the shame of his failure. Catherine stared at him, her face a mask of cold horror, but I could see it in her eyes. She wasn't appalled by the crime, she was appalled by the failure. The fact that he had been caught and that he had lied to her was the real betrayal. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was pure venom. She asked him if their entire life was a fraud. She started screaming, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. The united front they had presented against me for weeks dissolved in an instant, replaced by a toxic explosion of blame and vicious accusations. They were tearing each other apart, and I just sat there silent, watching the fire I had started consume them both. Through all the screaming and sobbing, I had not said a word. Now I did. My voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the chaos like a surgeon's scalpel. That's enough. They both fell silent, their tear-streaked, hate-filled faces turning to me. For the first time in years, they were truly seeing me. I ignored them. I turned my gaze to the only other sane person in the room. I looked at Arthur, and the frail, confused old woman they had tried to create was gone forever. I was in command now. Arthur, I said, my voice steady and clear, please begin the process of revoking the power of attorney immediately and schedule a full board meeting for the foundation. We have a lot of work to do. My son and his wife just stared, their mouths agape, suddenly powerless. Their fate was now entirely in my hands. In my line of work, you learn that the most critical procedures are performed not with passion, but with precision. Vengeance, I decided, was no different. It shouldn't be a messy, emotional affair. It should be a clean, well-executed operation. The perfect operating theater for this procedure was not a courtroom or a living room, but the formal boardroom of the Westchester Children's Charity, a place where my son had spent years cultivating his image as a community pillar. It was the heart of his world, a room paneled in dark mahogany and hung with portraits of past benefactors, a place that smelled of old money and self-satisfaction. Arthur's legal summons had been impossible for James to ignore, so he was there, sitting at the long, polished table, looking pale and gaunt, a ghost at his own wake. The other board members, the titans of Westchester's social and professional circles, were all there too. They'd been told I had requested the meeting to announce a major philanthropic gift, and their faces were filled with polite, expectant curiosity. I let the anticipation build for a moment before I stood. I was flanked by Arthur on my right, his briefcase a symbol of the hard facts to come, and Maria on my left, her quiet dignity a testament to the goodness I was choosing to reward. I did not raise my voice. I did not look at my son. I addressed the chairman, a man I'd known for 30 years, and calmly announced that I was here to discuss the future of my estate. Due to recent discoveries of gross financial mismanagement and profound familial misconduct, I explained I was restructuring my entire legacy. A confused murmur went through the room. I then turned the floor over to my lawyer, Arthur, to provide the necessary context for the board's due diligence. Arthur was magnificent. He spoke in the dry, dispassionate tones of a lawyer reading a prospectus. There was no anger, no accusation, just a clinical presentation of facts. He informed the board that as a preliminary step to the formation of my new foundation, a review of my finances had been conducted. This review, he stated, had uncovered a fraudulently obtained power of attorney, which had now been legally revoked. He continued by noting that my son, a member of their very board, was the subject of a pending SEC investigation related to his management of client funds. He never once called James a thief or a liar. He didn't have to. He simply laid out the truth as a series of unfortunate but legally significant events. The evidence was presented not as an attack, but as a necessary and regrettable disclosure before the establishment of a major charitable entity. The real punishment, the true reckoning, wasn't in Arthur's words. It was in the silence that followed. It was in watching the faces of the other board members. I saw their polite curiosity curdle into confusion, then shift to dawning horror, and finally settle into a quiet, cold disgust. In this world, financial ruin is a tragedy, but public shame is a death sentence. They didn't shout at James. They didn't accuse him. That would have been unseemly. Instead, they did something far more devastating. They simply turned away from him. One by one, they physically angled their bodies away, leaving him utterly isolated at the polished table. The chairman cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent room. He looked at my son, his expression not angry but deeply disappointed. And he delivered the final quiet cut. "James," he said, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the room, "I think it's time for you to tender your resignation from this board." It was the social execution my son had feared his entire life. Then I stood one last time to deliver my final proportionate justice. I announced the official formation of my new philanthropic endeavor, the Legacy of Care Foundation. I explained that its mission would be to provide support and legal aid to elderly individuals facing neglect and financial exploitation. A quiet gasp went through the room as the full, brutal poetry of my decision became clear. I then introduced Maria, my former caregiver, as the foundation's new executive director, rewarding her kindness and integrity in the most public way I could. And for my final act, I announced the foundation's first major project, a fully funded legal aid clinic dedicated to suing people just like my son. I had not destroyed James out of spite. I had simply taken the fortune he tried to steal and transformed it into a permanent, powerful weapon against the very cruelty he represented. He was left with nothing. Not my money, not his reputation, not even the dignity of a direct accusation. He was left with only the quiet, suffocating weight of his own shame. You know, in a place like Westchester, news travels faster than a brush fire. The whispers that started in that boardroom became a roar that ripped through the social scene before the week was out. My son's world didn't just crumble. It was publicly dismantled piece by piece. The consequences were swift and brutal. James was fired from his firm, the partners issuing a terse statement about professional ethics. Catherine, who lived and breathed for her status at the country club, was suddenly met with averted eyes and conversations that abruptly ended when she approached. Within a month, the ultimate symbol of their ruin appeared a for sale sign, was hammered into the perfect manicured lawn of their ostentatious house, the one they'd been so proud of. They were being forced to sell it all off to pay the legal fees that were just beginning to mount. The gilded cage they had built was being auctioned off to the highest bidder. 6 months later, the dust had settled, revealing two very different paths. James, stripped of his arrogance and pride, had begun the slow, painful work of facing himself. I heard through Arthur that he was in therapy. He'd taken a low-level accounting job in a small firm 2 towns over, a humbling fall from grace. One day, a small, plain envelope arrived for me. Inside was a short, handwritten letter. It wasn't filled with excuses or justifications. It was just a few simple sentences of apology. He was sorry for the pain, for the betrayal, for the fear he had caused. I read it, folded it, and put it away without comment. His journey toward accountability was his own to walk. It had nothing to do with me anymore. Catherine, however, remained trapped in her bitterness. She had left James and moved in with her sister, telling anyone who would listen that I was a cruel, vindictive old woman who had destroyed her family out of spite. She couldn't see her own role in the collapse. Some people, I suppose, would rather live in the ruins of a lie than build something new with the truth. My own life, in contrast, had never felt so full. The frail woman who sat silently at that brunch table was gone. In her place was a woman with a purpose. I was vibrant, engaged, my days filled not with lonely silence, but with the hum of meaningful work. I wasn't a patient anymore. I was the chairwoman of the board. I would sit at the head of the conference table for the Legacy of Care Foundation, my voice clear and decisive, working alongside Maria not as her charge, but as her respected colleague. We built something powerful together, something real. I reconnected with old friends I'd let drift away, my home now filled with the warmth of genuine laughter and easy conversation. I was no longer an ornament in someone else's life. I was the architect of my own. The other day, I was sitting on a bench in the park, enjoying the crisp autumn air. The leaves were turning brilliant shades of orange and red, and the sky was a perfect, cloudless blue. I was reading a letter from the first woman our foundation had helped a woman who had found the courage and resources to leave an abusive family situation. Her words of gratitude were a balm to my soul. After a few minutes, Maria joined me, handing me a warm cup of tea, before sitting down, and we shared a comfortable, easy smile. As we sat there, I saw a figure walking alone on a path across the park. It was James. He looked older, Tired, the weight of his actions etched onto his face. He glanced up, and for a brief moment, our eyes met. There was no anger in my gaze, no lingering bitterness. There was only a quiet finality. This wasn't about winning or losing anymore. This was about reclaiming a life, my life, and transforming the pain of the past into a powerful, lasting legacy of care. The new reality was permanent, and it was peaceful. In the end, she learned that understanding the desperation that drove her son did not mean she had to accept the harm he caused. Her final victory wasn't about simple revenge, but about complex, proportionate justice. It became a powerful lesson in self-respect, proving that protecting one's legacy from those who would squander it is not a cruel act, but a necessary one. She demonstrated what real justice looks like when it's wielded with wisdom. It isn't about inflicting pain, but about restoring balance. It is fair, firm, and ultimately a force for good.